The silver gilt clock atop the mahogany mantel struck 10, and in that precise second, I chose to shatter the world. The orchestra was midway through a spirited waltz, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and expensive lilies, when I walked to the center of the parquet floor. I did not dance. I did not shout. I simply stopped in front of the most scrutinized woman in the kingdom, Miss Oswina Thistlethwaite, and handed her a small, tarnished brass key. The music died as if the conductor had been struck by lightning. Fans snapped shut, the rhythmic scraping of silk slippers ceased instantly. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird in a cage of fine wool, but my face remained a mask of marble. I saw the blood drain from Oswina's cheeks, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored my own internal chaos. In that vacuum of sound, the heavy weight of 100 reputations began to fracture. I had bypassed every rule of engagement, every choreographed step of the season, to deliver a message that required no voice. The scandal was instantaneous, a physical heat that rose from the floorboards. I stood there, the man they called the Invisible Gentleman, Ptolemy Vane, suddenly the sun around which every gasping planet revolved. The crisis was not coming, it had arrived, and it was absolute. I felt the protagonist's deep sense of play and emotional connection immediately. This was for my father, and for the girl who had forgotten me. The stakes were nothing less than the truth of our lives, and the silence was my reckoning. The silence stretched until it became a physical ache in the room. The ton hovered like vultures, their feathered headpieces nodding as they leaned in to witness the carnage of a reputation. They searched my face for a crack, a tremor, or any sign of the forgettable man they thought they knew. But I remained a marble statue, unyielding and cold. I was no longer the man they ignored. I was the man they could no longer understand, and in the rigid hierarchy of London, mystery is more dangerous than a loaded pistol. My pulse was a steady thrum of defiance. I watched as the young lords and aging countesses exchanged frantic glances, their mental ledgers spinning to find a reason for my behavior. They had spent years treating me as part of the furniture, a background fixture of no particular consequence. Now, that very invisibility became my greatest weapon. By refusing to explain, I forced them to confront their own assumptions. I stood my ground, my eyes locked onto Oswina's trembling hands. The power dynamic had shifted in the space of a heartbeat. I had no title, no vast lands, and no booming voice, yet I had paralyzed the most powerful drawing room in the empire. It was the first time I felt truly seen, not as a social peer, but as a force of nature. The mystery I had cultivated was a poison now seeping into their comfortable certainty. They wanted a show, but I gave them a void, and in that void, their fears began to grow like shadows at dusk. I watched the closely watched lady stand alone in the center of the ballroom, a solitary figure in a sea of retreating silk. Her friends, those shimmering birds of prey who had preened in her reflected light just moments ago, retreated like shadows at noon. They didn't want to be stained by the unknown scandal I had dropped at her feet. Across the room, Merrin Sunderland whispered behind her ostrich feather fan, her eyes whetted like razors, already calculating how to use Oswina's downfall to her own advantage. My silence was a knife, and it was cutting through the fine silk of their social fabric with surgical precision. Oswina looked at me, her chest heaving as she tried to maintain the composure she had been taught since the nursery. I felt a pang of raw empathy, but I did not blink. This was the fire that would burn away the dross of her existence. The emotional tension was so thick I could almost taste the salt of her unshed tears. Every pair of eyes in the room was a weight, pressing down on her, measuring her worth in the face of my silent accusation. I remained a pillar of unbothered calm, refusing to grant her, or the crowd, the mercy of a single word. I wanted them to feel the crushing weight of the unexplained. The ballroom was no longer a place of celebration. It was a courtroom where the defendant hadn't even heard the charges yet. And I was both the judge and the evidence. Then came the hawk. Lady Sophronia Thistlethwaite descended upon us, her heavy brocade skirts hissing against the floor like a serpent in the grass. She was the matriarch of the season, a woman who could make or break a lineage with a single nod of her head. She reached for my arm, her grip surprisingly strong, her eyes burning with a desperate, cold fury. She tried to drag me toward the shadows of the withdrawing room, desperate to fix the unfixable and pull the veil back over her family's secrets. I did not yield. I gave a single, microscopic shake of my head. No. The gasp from the crowd was louder than any shout could have been. I had just declared war on a matriarch without uttering a syllable of dissent. Lady Sophronia's face contorted, her carefully applied rouge standing out in stark patches against her sudden pallor. She realized then that I was not a man who could be bribed with a dance or intimidated by a scowl. I was the personification of her past, and I was refusing to be buried. The stakes were now visible to everyone. I had insulted the most powerful woman in the room, and I had done it with the effortless grace of a man who had nothing left to lose. My emotional connection to this moment was a bridge of fire back to my childhood, to the day her husband had destroyed my father's name while I watched from the hallway. Now, it was her turn to watch as the architecture of her life began to crumble. By the time the sun rose over the soot-stained chimneys of London, the poison had already spread through every breakfast parlour and gentleman's club in the city. A rumour, thin as a wire but just as lethal, whispered that I had been planning this grand unravelling for decades. It suggested that my every quiet word and humble bow over the last 3 seasons had been part of a long game, a slow-burn strategy hidden beneath my mild manners. When the news finally reached Oswina in her morning room, her entire world tilted on its axis. She realized that every look we'd shared, every brief conversation about the weather or the music, was actually part of a map she couldn't read. She sat amidst her untouched porcelain, the brass keys sitting on the table like a live coal. For the first time, she saw me not as a boring suitor, but as a master architect. The realization was a crisis of identity. If I had been acting, who else was? The empire of whispers was now eating itself alive, trying to reconstruct my motives from years of silence. I sat in my own small study, watching the light hit the dust motes, perfectly still. I had thrown the first stone, and the ripples were now waves that threatened to drown everyone who had ever built their life on a lie. The emotional investment I had in this chaos was not born of malice, but of a desperate need for the truth to be the only thing left standing when the dust settled. The ghost of an old debt, 20 years cold and buried under layers of polite forgetfulness, began to walk the streets of Mayfair. I didn't speak of it to the journalists or the gossips who hovered near my doorstep. I simply let the weight of their own guilt do the heavy lifting. I walked through the park with my head held high, my silence an invitation for the guilty to invent their own terrors. I saw the way men of high standing suddenly found interest in their watch chains when I passed. They remembered my father, though they had spent 2 decades pretending they didn't. They remembered the Thistlethwaite maneuver that had stripped my family of our lands and our dignity. Now, seeing me standing tall and silent, they feared I was the vanguard of a reckoning that would include them all. I didn't need to make a list of names, they were making them for me in their own panicked minds. The debt was no longer a financial figure, it was a moral vacuum that was pulling the ton into its center. My restraint was my power. Every time I refused to comment, the value of my silence increased. I was the ghost at the feast, the reminder that no sin is ever truly forgotten as long as one person is left to remember it. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction, not from the pain I was causing, but from the honesty I was forcing upon a city that hated the light. Invitations that had been the lifeblood of my social existence suddenly vanished, and doors that had once been tepidly open now slammed shut with a finality that echoed in the empty streets. I was a social leper, a man who had broken the cardinal rule of the Victorian age, never make a scene. Yet, despite my isolation, my influence grew in the shadows like ivy on a ruin. People feared what I knew, and even more, they feared why I wasn't telling it. I became the mirror reflecting their rotting hearts, a silent judge whose very presence made the most seasoned liar stutter. I would sit in the corner of a coffee house, and the volume of the room would drop 10 decibels. I was a gravitational force, drawing the curiosity of the desperate and the dread of the powerful. Oswina's social orbit was destabilizing even faster. Her suitors were fleeing, her invitations were drying up, and her mother's influence was waning like a dying candle. I watched it all from a distance, my heart aching for the girl she used to be, but knowing this was the only way to save the woman she could become. My silence was a shield as much as a sword. As long as I said nothing, they could prove nothing, and their imagination was a far more effective torturer than I could ever be. I was the quietest man in London, and I was holding the city's breath in my hands. I made my next move with the cold precision of a chess master. I sent a formal declaration to the Thistlethwaite solicitor, a document that stated my intention to oversee and rectify the Thistlethwaite family interests. It wasn't a romance, it was a takeover. It was a public claim on their very foundation, delivered with the dry legalism of a bank foreclosure. The Ton gasped when the news leaked, as I knew it would. It was the most shocking move of the season, a man of no standing claiming the right to manage the affairs of a great house. I revealed nothing of my personal feelings, leaving the gossips to wonder if I was a gold digger, a madman, or something far more calculated. Oswina, I heard, had locked herself in her room, refusing to see even her mother. The stakes had moved from social standing to total survival. I was claiming the right to look into their ledgers, their deeds, and their skeletons. I felt the protagonist's deep sense of play here. I was playing with their very lives, but the game was rigged in favor of the truth. I remained in my lodgings, refusing all visitors, my expression a blank page that everyone was desperate to write upon. The evening when the entire season fell into breathless silence had been just the beginning. Now, the silence was turning into a scream that only the guilty could hear. I was the quiet gentleman, and I was about to bring an empire to its knees. I saw it then, at the edge of a garden party I wasn't supposed to attend. Miss Celandine Vosmere, Oswina's lifelong rival, was panicking. For years, Celandine had been the one to whisper the loudest, to watch the most closely, and to strike the hardest. But as she watched me from across the manicured lawn, her usual smugness was gone, replaced by a flickering, genuine terror. I realized in that moment that she wasn't panicking for Oswina, she was panicking for herself. The Thistlethwaites were the cornerstone of her own social architecture. If their house fell, the shockwave would level the entire neighborhood of her ambitions. Something beneath their shared history was fracturing, and Celandine, for all her sharp wit, was unprepared for a silent opponent who didn't play by the rules of engagement. I watched her hand tremble as she reached for a glass of champagne. I didn't approach her. I didn't have to. The mere fact that I was there, watching her with that same unblinking calm, was enough to make her foundations crumble. I saw the realization dawn on her. I wasn't just after the Thistlethwaites. I was the end of the world as she knew it. The rivalry that had defined her life was now a liability. Someone else stood to lose everything, and the fear in her eyes was the most honest thing I had seen all season. I turned away, leaving her to drown in the silence of her own making. The tarnished brass key finally found its lock. In a dusty, forgotten safe deposit box in a bank near the docks, the letters surfaced, proof of financial rot, calculated betrayals, and a legacy of social theft that dated back 20 years. I didn't publish them in the papers. I didn't take them to the magistrate. I simply held them in my hands, feeling the weight of the paper like the weight of a soul. The silence of the ink was deafening. These were the documents that proved my father had been framed, and that the Thistlethwaite fortune was built on a foundation of stolen dreams. My restraint became my ultimate weapon. By holding the letters and saying nothing, I kept the entire ton in a state of agonizing suspense. Everyone knew I had something, but no one knew what. Panic spread through the drawing rooms like a contagion. Lady Sophronia's allies began to turn on each other, desperate to ensure their own names weren't mentioned in whatever revelations I was holding. I felt the protagonist's emotional connection to these old, yellowed pages. They were the physical manifestation of my lost childhood. But I was not a cruel man. I would not use them to destroy for the sake of destruction. I would use them to reveal. The evening when the entire season fell into breathless silence was now a permanent state of being for the Victorian elite. I was the gentleman no one feared, and I was holding the matches to their entire world. My reputation strengthened in direct proportion to how quiet I became. It was a paradox that the ton couldn't solve. Usually, a scandal-plagued man would be shouting his innocence from the rooftops or fleeing to the continent. By doing neither, I became an enigma of authority. Silence became my sovereign power. It terrified the guilty because it gave them nothing to argue against. You can debate a lie, but you cannot debate a void. I moved through the city like a phantom judge, my presence alone enough to turn a heated conversation cold. I would walk into a club, and men would suddenly find their newspapers deeply fascinating. They were terrified that a single word from me would shatter their fragile glass houses. I felt a deep sense of responsibility. I wasn't doing this for ego, but for the restoration of a truth that had been buried for too long. Oswina's standing was crumbling, but she was watching me with a new, sharp intensity. She was beginning to see the man behind the mask, the one who didn't need a title to command a room. The emotional tension between us was a taut wire, vibrating with everything we hadn't said. I was the mirror reflecting the decay of an entire era, and the reflection was so hideous that they couldn't look away. My stillness was not a lack of action, it was the ultimate action. In the dim, shadow-filled library of a mutual acquaintance, Oswina finally found the courage to confront me. The room smelled of old leather and wood smoke, a sanctuary away from the prying eyes of the ballroom. She looked at me, her face pale but her eyes burning with a desperate clarity. "You aren't reacting to us, are you, Mr. Vane?" she whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. "You are steering us." I looked at her, and for a moment, the mask of the invisible gentleman nearly slipped. I wanted to reach out, to take her hand and tell her that every move I made was a step toward her freedom. But the music wasn't over yet, and the final movement required my absolute restraint. "I am merely standing still, Miss Thistlethwaite," I replied, my voice a low, steady hum in the quiet room. "It is the world that is spinning around me." She saw the truth then, that I was the conductor of this silent symphony. The realization shook her to her core. She saw that I wasn't a victim of the scandal, but its creator. I was steering her toward a reckoning she wasn't sure she could survive. The emotional investment in that moment was staggering. We were two souls trapped in a cage of our own history, and I was the one with the key. The memory finally fractured open for her, a jagged piece of the past that she had tried to bury under layers of silk and propriety. She remembered a frozen lake, 20 years ago, and a boy standing in the shadows of the willow trees while her father made the deal that destroyed a man's soul. That boy had been me. She saw the connection now, the reason for the brass key, the reason for the silence, and the reason I had reappeared in her life like a ghost from a shipwreck. I was the debt coming due, a living reminder of the original sin that had built her house. Her father's greed and my father's ruin were two sides of the same tarnished coin. I watched the realization wash over her face, a wave of horror followed by a strange, quiet understanding. I had been present long before society noticed me, a silent witness to the crime that had defined us both. The stakes were no longer just about reputations, they were about the very souls of our families. I stood there, the quiet gentleman who had waited 2 decades for this moment of recognition. I didn't need to speak, the past was speaking for me now, its voice a roar in the silence of the library. We were bound by a secret that was older than the season, and the reckoning was finally here. The season began to crack in earnest, the fine porcelain of Victorian society splintering into 1,000 jagged pieces. Engagements were dissolved with cold, one-sentence notices in the Gazette. Alliances that had stood for generations crumbled as families scrambled to distance themselves from the Thistlethwaite name. The very air of London felt heavy with the scent of ozone before a storm. Through it all, I remained untouched, the calm eye of a hurricane that was leveling Mayfair. I was the only constant in a world of shifting loyalties. Oswina became the epicenter of the storm, the target of every frustrated ambition and broken hope in the city. Her rivals smiled as they watched her fall, not realizing that the ground was shaking beneath them too. And in the shadows, Lady Sophronia was preparing her poison, a desperate, final counterstrike designed to silence me forever. I felt the danger closing in, a cold wind on the back of my neck, but I did not flinch. I had established the high stakes from the first second, and I was prepared to see the game to its end. The emotional tension was a physical pressure, a weight in my chest that made every breath a victory. I was no longer just a man, I was a reckoning, and the Empire of Whispers was about to face the truth. At the Grand Vauxhall Gala, amidst the flickering lanterns and the forced laughter of a dying season, Lady Sophronia struck. She gathered a circle of the most influential peers and, with a voice full of practiced, maternal tragedy, accused me of being a predator, a blackmailer who had coerced her daughter and was now holding the family hostage with fabricated lies. It was a masterpiece of social execution, designed to turn my silence against me. The crowd turned, their faces twisted with a new, dark hunger for my downfall. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice to defend my honor. I simply waited until she had finished her performance, until the last echo of her accusation had faded into the night air. Then, I reached into my coat and held up a single, notarized contract, the original document her husband had signed to frame my father, witnessed by men who were still alive. I held it up for the Duke of Ethelgard to see. The silence that followed was absolute. Her empire turned to ash in seconds. The counterstrike hadn't just failed, it had exposed the very heart of her corruption. I stood my ground, a silent victor in a field of social ruins. The high stakes were finally settled, and the lady's mother was left with nothing but the echoes of her own lies. I had brought the empire to its knees without uttering a word of defense. I finally spoke to her in the small, quiet hours of the morning, in the moonlit garden of her family's estate. My voice felt foreign in my own throat, a ghost of 20 years of longing and restraint. "I did not come to destroy you, Oswina," I said, the words heavy with the weight of everything I had suppressed. "I came to free you." The purpose of the silence hadn't been to humiliate her, but to burn away the false world that was suffocating her. I was offering her the only thing the tongue couldn't, a life built on truth rather than whispers. Protection, in its purest form, often looks like destruction to those who are clinging to a falling house. She looked at me, and for the first time, the distance between us vanished. The gentleman's true intent wasn't a game of power, it was a rescue mission for a soul trapped in silk. The emotional investment in that moment was overwhelming. I had spent my entire life preparing for this conversation, and now that it was happening, the silence felt like a blessing rather than a weapon. I wasn't just the quiet gentleman anymore. I was a man who had finally found his voice in the service of the woman he loved. The crisis was over, and the truth was the only thing left standing. Society tried to pivot with the clumsy grace of a wounded animal. Suddenly, the same people who had crossed the street to avoid me were trying to claim me as a hero of the age. They saw through their own vanity and tried to paint my silence as noble restraint rather than the calculated reckoning it had been. It was a pathetic display of social survival, and I saw right through it. But pride does not retreat quietly. Those who had been most complicit in my father's ruin began to harbor a new, bitter resentment. They realized that by saving Oswina, I had exposed their own lack of character. The emotional tension shifted from the ballroom to the boardrooms, where the remnants of the old guard tried to find a way to discredit the truth I had revealed. I remained firm, my resolve unshakable. I had established the high stakes, and I would not allow them to be lowered by the fickle whims of the ton. Oswina stood by my side, her presence a silent testament to the change I had wrought. We were no longer characters in their play, we were the authors of our own. The crisis had passed, but the work of rebuilding a life on honesty was just beginning. I watched the city from my balcony, a quiet man who had finally found his place in a world that had once tried to erase him. Celandine Vosmere's position imploded with a suddenness that shocked even her most cynical admirers. Her own lies, built up over years of social climbing, finally caught fire in the heat of the truth I had released. I didn't even have to light the match, her own panic did the work for me. She had tried to fuel Sophronia's fire, and now the backdraft was consuming her. I watched her from across a crowded room as she realized she had no allies left. Her rivals, who had once feared her, now laughed openly at her desperation. It was a grim, satisfying moment, not because of the cruelty of it, but because of the justice. She had built her life on the destruction of others, and now she was being destroyed by the very same machinery. I didn't feel triumph, only a deep, weary sense of closure. The closely watched lady was finally free of her adversary, and the silence of the ballroom was now a space of peace rather than fear. Celandine's collapse was the final proof that a life built on whispers cannot survive the light. I turned away from her, my heart already moving toward the future. The empire of whispers was gone, and in its place, something new and fragile was beginning to grow. The final truth emerged during the last great ball of the season, a night when the air was cool and the stars were bright over London. Lady Sophronia, in her final act of desperation, had tried to hide the fact that she had betrayed not just my father, but her own daughter's inheritance to maintain her social standing. When the documents were finally laid bare, the ballroom fell silent for the last time. The lies were finally exhausted. There was no more room for whispers, no more room for excuses. Sophronia stood in the center of the room, a broken queen in a ruined palace. I looked at Oswina and saw the pain in her eyes, but also the strength. She knew the truth now, and she was no longer afraid of it. The emotional investment of the entire season had led to this moment of absolute clarity. The quiet gentleman had finished his work. I had brought the empire to its knees, and I had done it with the truth as my only weapon. The silence that followed was not one of shock, but of reckoning. Every person in that room had to face the reality of who they were and what they had supported. It was the end of an era, and the beginning of a life. The Ton tried to rewrite history as they always did, but Oswina and I stood at a crossroads that they couldn't navigate. She had to choose between the comfortable, familiar lies of her past and the difficult, beautiful truth of her future. She chose clarity over pride. She chose the man who had brought her world down to save her soul. We stood together in the aftermath, two people who had survived a social earthquake and come out stronger on the other side. The emotional connection between us was a bridge over the wreckage of the season. I felt a deep sense of peace, a quiet satisfaction that the boy from 20 years ago had finally found his justice. The stakes had been high, the crisis had been absolute, but the result was a life built on the only thing that matters. We were no longer the invisible gentleman and the closely watched lady. We were just Ptolemy and Oswina, two souls who had found each other in the silence. The evening when the entire season fell into breathless silence was now a memory, a turning point in a story that was finally our own. We walked out of the ballroom together, leaving the whispers behind us forever. I faced the fallen matriarch in her own darkened drawing room, the air thick with the scent of old roses and defeat. Lady Sophronia begged for nothing, her pride still holding her together like a rusted suit of armor. I gave her the only mercy I could, exile. I had ensured the Thistlethwaite name was saved from total ruin for Oswina's sake, but the woman who had presided over the empire of whispers was gone. She would leave London and never return, a ghost in a country house far from the city she had tried to rule. It was a reckoning that reshaped Oswina's future, stripping away the toxic influence of a mother who had never truly known her. I felt no joy in her downfall, only a sense of completion. The debt was paid, and the cycle of betrayal was broken. I left her sitting in the shadows of her own making, a quiet gentleman who had finally cleared the way for a new generation. The future was bright, and the past was finally at rest. I walked out into the London night, the stars my only witnesses, and felt the weight of 20 years finally lift from my shoulders. Reputation returned to us, but it was sharper now, tempered in the fire of the truth. People looked at me with a new kind of respect, a quiet recognition of the man I had always been. But one tension remained: could a man who had started a social war ever truly find peace? I had spent so long being the architect of a reckoning that I wasn't sure how to be anything else. The emotional investment I had in the conflict had been my fuel for 2 decades. Now, in the quiet aftermath, I had to learn how to live for something other than justice. Oswina was my anchor, her presence a constant reminder of why I had done it all. We moved through the world with a newfound, jagged bravery, no longer afraid of the whispers or the shadows. The crisis had made us, but it was the peace that would define us. I stood by the window of our new home, watching the city I had changed, and realized that the greatest victory wasn't the downfall of our enemies, but the life we were building together. The quiet gentleman had found his voice, and it was a song of hope rather than a cry of war. "Was it for the debt, or was it for me?" she asked one evening, her voice a soft question in the twilight. We were sitting on the terrace, the city of London a distant hum of lights below us. I looked at her, and the truth was the only thing I could offer. "It was for the boy who loved you from the shadows 20 years ago," I replied, my voice thick with the weight of the past. "He didn't care about principles or debts. He just wanted you to be free from the lies that were killing you." The answer unsettled her, because it meant that my entire life had been a long, silent prayer for her happiness. It made the silence of the last 2 decades feel like a conversation we had been having all along. The emotional connection between us was a fire that had been burning in the dark for a lifetime. She took my hand, her fingers interlaced with mine, and the tension of the question dissolved into a profound, shared understanding. I had done it all for her, and she was the only reward I had ever wanted. The quiet gentleman had finally spoken his truth, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever said. The final ball of the following season arrived, and we entered the room together as a married couple. The ton fell into a breathless silence once more as we walked through the doors, but this time, the atmosphere was different. They weren't waiting for a scandal, they were waiting for our lead. We had become the new center of the social world, the anchors of a society that was trying to find its way back to honesty. The invisible gentleman and the closely watched lady were now the standards by which everyone else was measured. I felt a deep sense of responsibility, but also a quiet, enduring pride. We had survived the crisis, and we had come out on the other side with our souls intact. The emotional investment of the ton was now focused on our success, a strange but satisfying reversal of fortune. We walked to the center of the floor, the same place where I had ruined our lives a year before, and prepared to start a new one. The silence was no longer a weapon, it was a canvas, and we were the ones who would paint the future upon it. I made the final move of the game that evening. I walked to the conductor and requested a simple, old-fashioned country tune, not the complex, artificial waltzes of the elite, but a melody that spoke of the earth and the heart. As the music began, Oswina and I danced with a joy that was infectious. The hierarchy of the season shifted in that moment. Authenticity became the new currency, and the artificial masks of the past began to fall away. People who had spent their lives performing for each other started to dance with genuine smiles on their faces. I had brought the empire of whispers to its knees, and in its place, I had built a world where people could finally be themselves. It was my last move, and it was a triumph of the spirit. The quiet gentleman had won the war, and the peace was more beautiful than he had ever imagined. We danced until the stars began to fade, a couple who had found their way through the darkness and into the light. The season was over, and the truth was the only thing left standing. Oswina claimed her agency in a way that shocked the city even more than my silence had. She announced that she was turning her father's ill-gotten wealth into a foundation to help families who had been ruined by the same financial predators who had once served him. She wasn't being watched anymore, she was being followed as a leader of a new moral movement in London. I watched her from the sidelines, my heart full of a pride that I couldn't put into words. She had taken the ruins of her life and built something beautiful from the rubble. She was no longer the closely watched lady, she was the woman who had changed the world. The emotional connection I felt to her in that moment was the strongest it had ever been. We were partners in every sense of the word, working together to ensure that the mistakes of the past were never repeated. The crisis was truly over, and the future was a promise we were keeping to each other. I was the quiet gentleman, and I was the luckiest man in the empire. Our enemies didn't meet with violent ends or dramatic arrests, they met with something far more devastating in the world of the Victorian elite: irrelevance. Celandine Vosmere and the remnants of Sophronia's circle were no longer the authors of London's stories. They had to watch from the sidelines as a new world was built without them, their whispers ignored and their influence gone. It was justice without cruelty, a steady and inevitable fading of their power that stung more deeply than any public scandal ever could. You cannot argue with a world that has simply moved on without you. I saw them sometimes at the edges of events, their faces bitter and lonely, and I felt a brief flash of pity before turning back to my own life. They were ghosts of an era that had died the night I handed over that brass key. The empire of whispers had been replaced by a community of character, and they had no place in it. The quiet gentleman had won the final battle by simply being better than the people who had tried to destroy him. The evening of the first silence became a legend in the drawing rooms of London, a story that was told and retold until it took on the quality of a myth. People spoke of the quiet gentleman who had saved a loud and shallow city from its own rot. The story would be embellished, of course, with people claiming I had shouted from the rooftops or fought a dozen duels, but the core of it, the power of a single, honest act in a room full of lies, remained true. I didn't mind the legend. It was a shield that protected our peace long after we had left the city behind. The emotional investment of the public in our story was a testament to their own desire for something real in a world of performance. I sat in my library and listened to the echoes of the past, knowing that I had done what I came to do. The silence had been my reckoning, and the legend was its echo. I was a man of my word, even when I didn't say a single one. We eventually left the city for the quiet, green hills of the country, leaving the soot and the secrets of London far behind. There were no more whispers in the hallways, no more masks to wear at dinner parties, and no more traps to avoid. Our lives were built on the steady, honest rhythm of the seasons, a life that felt as real as the earth beneath our feet. I looked at Oswina as she walked through the garden, the sunlight catching the gold in her hair, and I realized that we had found the only thing worth having in this world. We were transformed, two souls who had survived the fire and come out on the other side with everything that mattered. The season ended not with a bang or a scandal, but with a long, satisfied sigh of relief. The quiet gentleman and his lady were finally home. The emotional tension of the past was gone, replaced by a peace that was as deep as the sea. We had found our voice in the silence, and it was a song of love that would last a lifetime. Looking at her now, as she sits across from me by the fire, I realized that silence was never my weakness, it was my ultimate strength. It was the only place where the truth could truly grow, away from the noise and the lies of a world that didn't understand the power of a quiet heart. London never forgot the quiet gentleman, and I never again had to use my silence as a weapon. I had found my voice in her, and she had found her freedom in me. The antagonist of my life, the fear of being forgotten, had finally been defeated. We stood together at the end of the story, two people who had changed the world by simply refusing to be anything other than honest. The empire of whispers was a distant memory, and the silence was now a sanctuary where we could finally be ourselves. I put down my pen and looked into the flames, a quiet man who had finally said everything he needed to say. The evening when the entire season fell into breathless silence was the beginning of our forever, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. We had ended it, not with blood, but with the absolute finality of the truth. I reached out and took her hand, and in the silence of our home, everything was perfect.